Hey guys, Dark Humility here. You can always catch me at twitch.tv/Dark Humility for 6 to 7 days a week of Diablo 2 action of all kinds, D2R and PD2. We do it all. Every manner of build, every manner of review, tier lists, guides, you name it, up in here. Today, we have a very awesome video where I present to you the updated TerraZone tier lists with an S, brought to you by Maxroll and myself. We are going to show you guys the definitive after testing picture of how good tier lists are for two major activities, which is item finding and for experience, which is the main one, experience. And before I do that, though, and get into the actual tier lists themselves and how much they've been updated and whatnot, I do like to say that our initial tier list and our initial approach was very different. Before the tier lists were launched, before the Terra Zones were launched in the actual ladder, even with beta testing and whatnot, it was kind of hard to tell because there wasn't a lot of running in groups. There wasn't a lot of solo power leveling in players' 8 teams. And at the same time, we tried to use a combined approach where we combine the considerations of experience and loot, but I think overall what that ended up doing was causing a lot more confusion. Before our list looked kind of jumbled, there's a lot of areas that were ranked really highly that people are like, wow, that's garbage for experience. Why would Maxwell rate that so highly? It's because loot was one of the primary considerations, and we just had a single TerraZone tier list, which I think most people all over YouTube and all over everywhere has done. Just one single unified tier list. Now, for some of them, it was experience was the only concern, but loot was a much greater weighted concern for us. So what we decided to do, and what was my idea originally, is to split the TerraZone tier list into two TerraZone tier lists. That way we can really give people useful information, information you guys can actually use when a Terra Zone comes up. Is this worth farming? Can I get good loot here? Or, is this going to be a good zone to start, power leveling my character towards 99? Or can I go to sleep for this hour and take a power nap because this area sucks? So, yeah, that pretty much it. A lot of us also lacked a lot of experience as well in terms of actually farming these areas. I think everyone did to some extent as well, so that also kind of factored into it. But now I am proud to present with over a month of very, very dedicated testing and grinding out the ladder. I myself got a level 99 on the hardcore ladder, which is where a lot of the experience in building the experience tier list comes from. And I could tell you kind of like, I've done all the Terra Zones multiple times, different player counts, and other people on the team have done it the same, some solo or duo farming them as well, to give you guys a very accurate picture of what's going on here. So without further ado, let's get into it. I actually plan on kind of going into my overall review of every area individually. Of course, you guys can access these tier lists yourself at maxroll.gg/D2/tier list/TerraZone tier list, which is now 2 tier lists. You can just click on whether you want loot or experience, and you're given a totally different tier list here on Maxroll. And you can get 2 very accurate tier lists now that reflect the 2 very separate and different concerns, because the truth is, whether or not a Terra Zone is good really depends on what you're trying to do. And we'll talk about that as we go through these tiers. Of course, I'll also be posting a link to my master document where I have all the tier lists in one place for patch 2.5, including the updated split Terra Zone tier lists. Alright, so let's kind of go over what, the experience Terra Zone tier list is all about. So we're going to go over the experience one first, which is the one I think that is most impactful, because the truth is, when it comes to loot gathering, The staple, tried and true farming areas like Travancore Pit, Ancient Tunnels, Stony Tomb, Mephisto farming, Chaos farming, and that kind of stuff, Arcane Sanctuary, that kind of stuff are all still going to be insanely good for loot no matter what the Terror Zone is. And experience is where Terror Zones really make a big difference, especially once your character hits level 94 plus, where you can make a maximum Terror Zone area level, which is 96. And of course, this Terror Zone takes into account, like, let's say you are a character with mobility, such as a sorceress, or a character with Enigma, or just a lot of teleport charges. Number of elite groups, monster types, monster density, and ease of access to mobs are the main things that really factor into how good an area is in terms of how much experience it's going to give you. Certain monster types give more experience than others. Density is really huge because level 96 monsters still provide a lot of experience, even to a level 98 character going towards 99, because they're not significantly lower than you. You don't have crazy experience penalties as you would with level 88 monsters in the old school Chaos and Throne areas, Veil Waves and whatnot. But yeah, at any rate, the general concern is, on average, how much experience are you going to get with a certain character or a certain approach. So let's dive into it. Let's do it. Let's talk about these areas in general. And, you guys can, of course, view these lists yourself. These are the overall tiers. And you guys can make your own judgments, of course. Let me know in the comments how right you think Maxroll got this on the second iteration, splitting loot and experience and whatnot, and if you guys actually think these are pretty accurate assessments of where the areas actually are. Without further ado, though, let's go into them once again. So we have Telrash's Tombs. Telrash's Tombs, I don't think needs any introduction. This area has always been insane for power leveling from level 15 to 20 in normal. Because just crazy density, crazy amount of elite packs. It's predictable where they spawn. Really high experience monster types like Guardians and Gore Bellies and things of that nature. Just really, really insane area. I would actually personally put this as the strongest experience farm in the game on average. It's really close with like Worldstone and Chaos, which have always been experienced bastions, even without Terror Zones. However, this, I on average, at all character levels, even in the high 90s, like I was getting way more experience here than anyone else, even in the low 90s with characters that are lower than 94, pushing that, because I've done that multiple times as well. Definitely pushed a lot of characters using Terror Zones this season, trying to really get a handle on how strong these areas are. And my goodness, Telrash's Tombs is busted. Just so many elites, so fast. You don't have to keep creating games. There's not a lot of downtime between loading screens. Just constantly one to the next. And if you have someone to ferry you from tomb to tomb with teleport and whatnot, it's just so crazy fast. It's also a very good Terror Zone to split as well naturally, because like people can start in other tombs, they can start at the other end of the tombs, and that gives you even more experience. So it's just such a good experience area. Chaos and Worldstone, particularly Chaos, is a bit harder to split, but you can, or should I say Worldstone's a bit harder to split, because typically in here you just go for the experience from the Bale Waves, and the Bale Waves being level 99 is pretty nutty for experience, as typically they're not that high of level at all. And then you have, of course, in Chaos, you can split the super uniques, Infector and Vizier and whatnot, but overall just smashing through Chaos is super effective, especially if you mostly focus on the super uniques here, mostly on the Bale Waves. And what you see here is just crazy experience because of the level 99 monsters everywhere, tons of super uniques, tons of density, tons of high experience monsters. So if you see any of these three Terror Zones particularly, you know you're in for a really GG experience. No doubt. No doubt. And so these are like solid S plus tier in my mind. S tier Terra zones. There's a bunch of other S tier Terra zones that are pretty close in how strong they are. Maybe not quite as strong as these very top ones, but they're significantly above all kinds of other Terra zones. So let's go through why that is. Flare Dungeon just has a crazy amount of elite packs in a tightly packed area, very dense. Flare Jungle's insanely dense. Tons and tons of flares. Just crazy, crazy experience if you can mill those with characters that can kill them fast, and since they have low HP, they're usually extremely easy to kill. You also just get lots of elite packs even on the way to Flare Dungeon and the Flare Jungle. Flare Jungle is really, really insane for experience. I don't know if I'd quite say on average it would average as much experience per hour as some of these very top ones, but it's definitely up there. Pit's kind of the same thing, actually. So as long as you have someone to ferry you to the pit, pit's very fast. It's very easy to find the pit. Once you're inside the pit, crazy density, tons of devilkins, tons of other types of monsters just everywhere, elites everywhere, tons of elites in a very, very compact area in pit 2 as well, so just guaranteed elites all the way throughout, and it's just crazy density, crazy low HP monsters, so it's super easy to clear and bang out that experience in any player account. One thing I should emphasize is that this goes for all player counts and all, whether or not you're sucking up all the experience yourself on a really good character or whether or not you're sharing it with others. These areas tend to be very consistently strong, and that's kind of what this tier list will reflect all the way throughout. Cathedral and Catacombs is nuts. The only main possible problem with this area is mobility. But, once again, this tier list assumes some level of mobility, as you kind of have to make some assumptions when you make a tier list, right? And this is crazy. Tons of elite packs everywhere on every single level. Tons of density. Level 4 is just crazy dense, elite packs and a boss on top of that. It's just, with Indariel, it's just crazy how many elite packs you can hit one after the other. Massive level as well, so also very easy to split. And splitting is also good as well. If you can get really solid splits, it's going to help your experience as well. So just crazy, crazy stuff coming in from these two. Pretty solid experience monster types as well. So then you have the Rocky Waste and you have the Stony Tomb. And this is just another crazy area. Beetles are crazy for experience, and you very routinely get them in here, but the Stony Tomb itself is just packed full of elites. Guaranteed super unique. It's like 10 elites oftentimes. Just you go in and just smash them all. Tons of density. Even on the way there, even though the Stony Tomb can be hard to find sometimes, the Rocky Waste is replete with really high experience elites. Just really insane farm for sure. Sewers 2. Sewers 2 is an area that I will admit that I may have underestimated and other people may have underestimated without testing it. But yeah, just crazy, crazy amounts of elite packs, really good density with the archers and the bone warriors. Even in the Radamant area, just 3 different levels, so also very easy to split. Yeah, just really consistently high experience everywhere, and just really, really solid monsters. I wouldn't put this area at the very top of the S tier, but it definitely is a cut above virtually every other Terra zone. And then, of course, Cold Plains and the Cave might have been the most underestimated area. And it's because not a lot of people run the Cave. Cold Plains itself is pretty solid. There's a lot of elite packs throughout the Cold Plains. It's a big area with lots of elite packs with the guaranteed super unique and Biji Bosch high HP or high experience enemies too in the Gargantuan beasts. However, it's not mainly the Cold Plains that's carrying this area. If it was just the Cold Plains, this Terra zone might be more like B tier. But the faster you can find the cave, the better is all I gotta say. Because once you can find the cave, which usually is, there's a lot of elite packs leading up to it. It's a very similar situation to the Stony Tomb and whatnot, or the pit, where you just get constant elite packs. Zombies too, so high experience, lots of density in there. Guaranteed archers, guaranteed super unique, and guaranteed elite spawns in Cave 2 as well, kind of like a pit situation. Just so many elite packs in such a small area, and yeah, it's really replete with experience, really insane area. So Cold Plains and Cave, I would say might be one of the more surprising ones in this list, but if you don't know how good that one for experience really is, I recommend trying it and running the Cave and see what your numbers are looking like. Your experience bar is going to burn rubber in there. So yeah, very, very crazy areas overall. These are definitely areas that really stand out as exemplars in terms of how fast you can generate experience on a character with mobility and or solid gear. Now, of course, if we go into the A tier, things start to get a little weaker, a little less consistent. Maybe they're more difficult to find in the case of like the Frozen River. Maybe there's some backtracking involved. I would definitely say Crystalline Passage and Frozen River is a cut above the other ice caves, because the Frozen River typically has a ton of evil urns, so there's so many guaranteed elite packs on top of other elite packs that already spawn there, on top of the super unique Frozen Stun, which is really solid stuff. Frozen River, though, is very difficult, though, and very dangerous compared to a lot of the areas in the S tier, which is going to slow you down quite a bit, if not outright kill you, which will make it harder for experience gain. Crystalline Passage is also solid in a lot of these ways, but I would say this is another one of those cases of like, Cold Plains and Cave. Crystalline Passage is kind of like the Cold Plains, but sometimes you do get evil urns in here as well. It's just harder to find the elites because there's more narrow corridors, whereas Cold Plains is more open, making them easier to access. So there's definitely a couple of weaknesses to this Terror Zone, but in terms of experience generation, Crystalline Passage, Frozen River is actually nuts. Tower Solar is kind of similar. It's maybe a little more difficult to find the elites, and they're a little bit more spread out maybe than a place like Cathedral or Catacombs. Also, finding the tower is one of the toughest Terror Zones to find. Despite it having 5 levels and having tons of elite packs and having guaranteed Countess and elite packs that are always on the 5th level, it's got a lot of very strong things going for it. As long as you have mobility, this is definitely a very tough area without mobility. However, if you can pull it off and you have the mobility, it's very solid. Tons of elite packs and whatnot. I just think it could be a little harder to find them. There's definitely more backtracking. It's not as kind of circular, somewhat of an area as like Catacombs is. So there are some weaknesses to this area, and finding it, I would say, is probably the biggest weakness. Whereas you have waypoints in the Cathedral and the Catacombs themselves to go from either end. This one is somewhere along the wall of the Black Marsh, and it's not always easy to find. Spider Forest and Spider Cavern, really, really solid with the number of elite packs you get, particularly as easy as they are to access in the cavern. Spider Forest, though, is a massive area. In a lot of cases, there's just a lot of areas where the elites don't spawn. You run out of elite packs. The Bramble Hulks give a ton of experience, though, and it's really easy to access most of the elite packs in the Spider Forest. The only main thing is sometimes finding the Spider Cavern can be a little difficult, which is really the only weakness of Spider Forest, Spider Cavern. And the density is also pretty good, too. It's also not, a good area to compare it to is Flare Jungle, Flare Dungeon, which is just more consistent density and elite packs throughout. There's also more levels to the dungeon as well. So there's definitely some real reasons this gets beat out, but there's a lot of elite packs in Spider Forest, Spider Cavern, a lot of good ones as well, and a lot of solid density. So definitely don't count out this Terror Zone. It's pretty solid. Of course, next up you will have the Dry Hills Halls of the Dead, another very solid Terror Zone. I'm even tempted somewhat to think of this as maybe another S tier Terror Zone, kind of alongside like Rocky Waste and Stony Tomb, because of just how many good elite packs there are in the Dry Hills typically. They might not be quite as consistent or good as the ones in Rocky Waste, though, and Halls of the Dead, in a lot of ways, is kind of a little bit of a weaker stony tomb. However, and with a lot of like backtracking and more complicated ways to get to where you're going. However, it's really solid. There's even a guaranteed super unique in Halls of the Dead 3. Tons of elite packs in here in the Dry Hills and Halls of the Dead. Dry Hills is just a lot more inconsistent, I would say, and Halls of the Dead is definitely a lot more inconsistent and not as crazy experience as the Tombs, not having quite as many high experience monsters. So, it's just like a weaker Tombs, if you ask me. It's quite a bit weaker, but it's still a very solid terror zone. Lots of density, tons of skeletons, unravelers, all kinds of good stuff in there. Cross Bazaar, Disused Fane, and Ruined Temple. So this is an area that I, and probably most people, definitely underestimated. Maybe not as much as some people underestimated the cave, but when it came to getting experience in here, it's actually really good. And the reason being is typically when you spawn right into the area in Cross Bazaar, there's usually elite packs right around you and right next to the temples. Inside the temples themselves, tons of density. Battlemaid Serena has tons of minions. Tons of elite packs just packed in these really small areas on top of leading up to them. Makes it a lot quicker of a terror zone. However, it's quick and packed. And that's kind of what you want in general. You want them packed. The only thing that really, keeps it from the S tier is the fact that finding the temples isn't always 100% consistent in the number of elite packs. And it's a little faster of a terror zone, which means more loading screens in an area maybe than an area like Cold Plains or Cave or other similar areas that definitely fit the bill in the S tier. And you're not getting quite that many elite packs as an S tier area to justify it. Lost City and Valley of the Snakes and the Claw Viper Temple. Mainly here, it's the fact that the zombies give you a ton of experience, and there's high experience monsters out in the Lost City. Lots of elite packs out in the Lost City, and the Claw Viper Temple is just packed full of density and elite packs. Finding this area is a little less consistent, though. So, once again, with the A tier areas, is less consistency, less clean farm. All these areas are really clean, really linear, really just easy to find the elite packs, get in and get out. They're also long enough to where it's not constant loading screens, where you're killing a significant amount of monsters and then you're getting out. In these areas, there's a little less consistency in that regard. However, all these areas have tons of elite packs that are very easily accessible still, and give you quite a bit in that regard. So, very good stuff. Of course, in the B tier, the areas definitely start to get weaker for experience generation, and you start to see some noticeable drops or heavy inconsistencies. Like, for instance, one set of areas that really comes to mind when you think of inconsistencies is Nilothox Temple all the way through Halls of Vought. You don't usually ever farm Halls of Vought for experience, and that would be an area you would focus for items. Halls of Pain and Anguish, though, can have the flares and can be, in some spawns, as good as Flare Jungle, pretty much. But these areas are huge, and finding the elites, they can be kind of anywhere in a pretty sprawling area, so finding them is also less consistent. The spawns can also be just really good, too. You can also get, like, Death Lords, but that's also a little bit less consistent. There are evil urns, though. There's always one evil urn in Halls of Pain, and there's just a lot of consistency in general, so it's definitely not a bad terror zone. Sometimes you just get really bad density, though. If there's no flares, you get bad monster types. It's hard to find the elite packs. They can be anywhere. And then, some parts of it are kind of a trap, like Halls of Vought. Definitely a lack of consistency in this area, but if it always spawned certain monsters, like if you always got Death Lords and Flares, and Beetles and Anguish, and you always got like Flares and Halls of Pain, You could definitely make a really strong argument for these, even despite how hard it might be finding the elite pack sometimes, at least being A tier, if not S tier. So the problem with these areas is just a lot of inconsistency in the spawn types, where they spawn, and other issues. But otherwise, it's a really solid area with solid monster types that can be good for experience. Outer Steppes and Plains of Despair is kind of similar. Some people could make the argument there should be at least A tier, but there's some issues with these areas in general when it comes to getting experience. Like, Outer Steppes typically has some pretty good experience monster types, but they can be harder to kill, to track down. You know, you get like flesh spawners and cave leapers. You get some kind of weird ass monsters. You also get like burning souls very commonly in Plains of Despair, which can be good for experience, but they're just oftentimes harder to deal with. The Israel can also ruin your experience and pop the monsters, giving you no experience. So if you like accidentally kill him, it's, you know, and the quality of the monster spawns is also kind of iffy. And of course, the Plains of Despair itself can be on the opposite side away from all the elite packs as well. So there's some access problems, some finding problems. It's kind of similar to these, honestly. Sometimes these areas can be really good. They just lack the consistency of the higher ranked areas. River of Flame and City of the Damned. Honestly, my advice in this one is literally just to stick to City of the Damned if you want the experience. River of Flame is just very inconsistent. You can spawn in there, and because it's such a huge area, it could take forever to traverse and find the elite packs. If you spawn in the actual waypoint, which I don't recommend, they can be on both sides of the waypoint. It's nasty. And then Fasto himself doesn't necessarily give you a lot of experience. So, because he doesn't have a minion group, unlike a lot of other super uniques in other areas. What I would do is I would stick to City of the Dam, which usually has a lot of elite packs in a very small area. They do lead to faster runs and more loading screens, though. So, and the quality of the spawns is also very scant. There's monsters that can be hard to track down in here, like bats. A lot of dangerous monsters as well. High HP monsters that are harder to kill, and you don't kill quite as quickly because the density is inconsistent. So another area that City of the Dam that can also be insane, but it really just depends on the spawns. That's kind of the general theme with pretty much all of those types of things in general. So it's definitely the case. Of course, Jail, also pretty similar. Harder to find the spawns. They can kind of be anywhere. I mean, that's kind of like with the halls, right? Lower HP monster types overall, though, unless you're talking about Pit Spawn Foul Dog, which is guaranteed in Jail 2. And they're just really hard to find because it's a very sprawling area. You know, that's definitely a theme with a lot of these B tier areas. They're very sprawling, and the elites can sometimes spawn in weird corners and crevices. It can be hard to see them because they're like behind walls or they're like in really small crevices. Definitely a theme with a lot of these areas. You know, that is the case to some extent with some A and S tier areas, but there's just so many elite packs and so much density, and they're so much easier to access that it doesn't matter. So, and the areas are at least more linear in the case of the tower, right? They're more linear. So that is definitely something to take into account here. Of course, we also have, so yeah, the jail's pretty solid. Definitely solid, decent density, decent number of elite packs. The density can be sometimes scant though, so it depends. Ancient's Way, Icy Cellar, honestly, pretty solid. The main issue here is that Icy Cellar is no frozen river, which is why you might see this area is very similar to this Terror Zone, but not quite. And the problem with Icy Cellar is that you typically just get champion spawns in the Icy Cellar, and you might know this if you've done the Icy Cellar Terror Zone recently. There's a lot of champion spawns, which don't give you as much experience as the elite spawns. Frozen River, on contrast, is mostly elite spawns. Ancient Sway, Icy Cellar in some cases. Yeah, it's just not as consistent. It is a small area though, and you can kill a lot of high value monsters very quickly, but it's also one of the most dangerous areas in the game. So even though it's pretty good for experience, it's kind of lacks as you might think there should be more elite packs in here when they're not, and it's really hard to kill the monsters sometimes and really frustrating. So that's another thing with some of these areas is some of these areas just have really high HP tough monsters, which is going to slow you down on average, even with gear, even with a decent amount of mobility. Of course, Glacial Trail. Glacial Trail is pretty solid. It doesn't use its side zone though, so it's kind of like one area, so it's really quick. And it can be hard finding the elite pack sometimes and identifying when you're actually finished with the area. There are the evil urns though, so it's pretty solid stuff. And you know, it doesn't have an area that's super dangerous without as much benefit as you might expect, like the Icy Cellar. So it's pretty solid. It's definitely up there. I definitely, once again, still think the best ice cave is definitely the Frozen River Crystalline Passage one, despite the dangerous monsters in Frozen River, and that's because Frozen River is just packed full of evil urns and elite packs, and it's just really solid if you can run it. Frigid Highlands. Frigid Highlands, well, after doing a lot of runs of this, you know, I honestly kind of was sour on this one in the beginning, but there's a technique you can make that you can do to make this run pretty much as well as any of these B tier areas, if not just as well and almost as well as some of the A tier areas in many cases. And that is to start at the Frigid Waypoint, of course. You kill Eldritch, and then you make sure you check the areas, the first areas before the first line of fortifications, and then you spawn all the elites, most of them there, and just past. By doing that, as long as you don't go past the first row of fortifications and you kind of stay in that area, you'll spawn most of the elites in a pretty small area. You spawn quite a few high HP ones as well. You get Shark's Tooth Slayer as well on top of Eldritch. And then there's usually elites maybe just past or around Shark Tooth Slayer. It's a very small area where you can hit a lot of monsters pretty fast. The main issue with this area is lack of consistency. The number of elite packs or the quality of them varies pretty highly between each run. Otherwise, it'd be at least an A tier area for sure because of how many are just spawning around there. Of course, you could also get Eyeback the Unleashed, which is the elite all the way at the end of the zone. However, that typically wastes time. But it depends, though. If you have people going ahead of the first set of fortifications before they check the whole first area before that first row of fortifications, they're going to spawn elites all the way up until Eyeback pretty much, so you may as well hit them. There's 3 super uniques in this area, though, so and on top of the other elites you can find, so it's pretty solid. It's a pretty solid area. Definitely stands out. In terms of those underlying Act 5 areas, it definitely is the best of all of them. You'll see the other ones are rated in the C and D tier, respectively, so there's definitely a lot more potential to this area. I will say, though, the lack of consistency really hurts it. Sometimes you just get a lot of elites in one area, and sometimes you get pretty much nothing. Except for Eldritch and maybe Shark Tooth Slayer. So yeah, it's one of those things that, you know, inconsistency is really the theme of Team B here, because a lot of these B tier areas can sometimes give you experience equivalent to like A or even S tier areas in certain spawns, but they're not really quite there with the consistency, whereas these areas are far more consistent, far more reliable. You always get a ton of packs all the way up. You always get good density, you know, whatever it is. And the S tier ones are exemplary. You know, they're just like, their consistency is every time. You get tons of elite packs in the pit, cave, cold plain, Stony Tomb, you know, Fire Jungle, whatever it is. And of course, Chaos, Worldstone, and Tombs with their high experience monsters. they've always been mainstays for a reason. So with level 99 monsters, they're just nuts. And with tombs, I mean, it's just crazy how many elite packs you can hit with that have high experience values and how much density you can clear in such a short amount of time. So it really, those are really the top areas, 100%, 100%. And you can really see that. I mean, you could definitely make an argument in this tier list for even like making these 3 areas, or maybe 4, kind of. There's like a couple. There's like some areas here where you could like make an S tier with, and then some of these other areas you can maybe form an A tier with maybe some of the current A tier, and then maybe you could form another B tier, and then you can kind of like stratify it a bit more. But I think this is pretty solid. Like every one of these areas in the S tier is really crazy for experience. So I think the way we did it is pretty solid here. But I could definitely see that argument. C tier, these areas really lack consistency, or they're really scant. They lack density. In most cases, they just are really poor for experience because they're really tiny areas in some cases. Finding the elites, they're kind of all over the place, or they're hard to access. Definitely, or there's just not a lot of elites at all. So let's kind of go over, like, what problems with the C tier that the C tier has for experience. We're starting to get into some of the quote unquote bad experience terror zones. These ones are definitely ones that you should be a little disappointed if you see. They could be cues to go to sleep. C, D, and F, and pretty much all these tiers are definitely ones where you're like, oh man. I mean, that should pretty much be your reaction once you see any of these terror zones. So, Burial Grounds, this one doesn't really need much of an introduction for why it's not very good. It can be hard to access, so you have to teleport all the way there. I mean, it's not as hard to find as like maybe the tower, but the tower rewards you, whereas Burial Grounds does not. You can kill Blood Raven, but her experience isn't very good. There are definitely good experience zombie packs and whatnot in the Crypt and the Mausoleum. However, very inconsistent, and they can be hard to find sometimes. I mean, normally monsters tend to spawn near where you enter the area, so that's just kind of a general tip for any viewers or anyone learning how to or wanting to know how to optimize their farming of these areas for experience or items or otherwise. Typically, the elites will spawn near the spawn point and where you stay around. So if you limit where you go in that area to just around the entrance area, typically that's where you're going to find most of the elite packs. And so that is the case for the Crypt and Mausoleum as well. However, most of the time, there might be very few. You might just get champions, and if you get champion type monsters, they can take the place of elite packs, making your experience really garbage in there. Density is bad in these areas, so if you don't find elite packs, you basically find nothing. And that's where the inconsistency really comes in. Sometimes there's a pretty solid number of elite packs between these two areas, and then other times you get almost nothing, and it feels like that entire game was a waste of time. And that's really what typifies the C tiers. Sometimes you just feel it was all a waste, and you barely got anything. Arcane for experience is kind of tough. You spawn in the very middle of the area, typically in the waypoint, which means what's going to happen is monsters, elites can actually spawn on all 4 sides, making it difficult to find them sometimes. They can spawn right around in the entrance area on all 4 sides. And then even if you go up one side, it's a very narrow area. Sometimes it can be difficult to kill the monsters in a lot of different builds. Even with mobility, it can be difficult sometimes to traverse the area somewhat. Of course, some builds like the Lightning Sorceress absolutely rip this area a new one. You'll see with the best element listed here, which these tier lists have that awesome feature where you can see what the best element is to solo farm these areas. If you wanted to know what areas are strong for your element, of course you can limit it here as well. Of course, the loot tier list also has this feature. So you can definitely see overall like what areas are going to be strong. And any element that is not listed might not necessarily be weak, but they typically are weaker elements. in a lot of cases due to immunities, and you need even better gear to kill them more consistently, especially in high player count. So it just depends. Cold is a bit of an exception so long as you have 195 cold mastery, but yeah, I mean, still, you know, it definitely requires a bit more. There's a bit more of a bar you have to hit there for cold to be good everywhere, but yeah, I mean, I think you guys probably get the idea. At any rate, Arcane, yeah, Arcane sometimes is scant as well. Not always a lot of elite packs in here due to champion spawns and other things. The density is more linear, so it's not as consistent. So it's just a harder area to get experience in, especially if you're in a group. Some of these areas could be decent too. One thing to note is if you're like soloing experience in a game full of 8 people, even really bad Terra zones can be pretty solid for pushing 99. And that's just simply because other people aren't sharing your experience. They're not taking elite packs without you being near them. There's a lot of reasons for that, but really what it comes down to, though, is you could pretty much do decently anywhere. But even in a solo P8 scenario, once you go down the tiers, the areas do get weaker, just overall, due to other various reasons. Mostly access, mostly the consistency of finding good monster types and high experience spawns. That's the other thing about Arcane, is not a lot of like really high experience monsters in there. Secret Cow level, I mean, even if you do sometimes get a decent number of elite packs, but it's just inconsistent. Secret Cow level is actually bad for experience. So this is something that might surprise a lot of people. I'd say people were pretty excited about this area when it came to experience in the beginning. But if we're being honest, in terms of we're only concerned with experience, the Secret Cow level is awful. And the reason being is that the elites are very tough to find because they're buried in packs of cows. Regular cows, you know, they've got good density, but they're very high experience, especially with the terrorized HP values. And they're very high HP. They're very high HP. And so they're pretty tough to kill. You're mostly just killing a sea of regular monsters. The elite packs are very few and far between, and they're difficult to identify and snipe. And all these things combined, also the fact that you need a leg, so that takes a bit, so there's some prep work there that is at least the equivalent of finding Tower Cellar, if not worse. I actually think it's worse, based on numerous tests. And it's really, really not a good experience zone. You can plow through the cows as fast as you want. Even if you have the most decked out Jabazon, it's still not going to be great for experience compared to these other zones with more elite packs, easier to get to, and easier to kill, even somewhat the HP and whatnot. Yeah, if you do have a decked out Jabazon, if you're soloing it in P8, that's probably your best case scenario in here, and it won't be that bad if that's what you have. But for the most part, I'd say for the majority of player count scenarios or other scenarios, you're not going to find this area that great for experience. Far Oasis. So Far Oasis, Darkwood, Stony Field, all are very similar terror zones. It's basically just a donut. You know, you just go around in a circle in the terror zone, you just kill all the elite packs, and you reset the game. Main issue is that the density in these areas is often scant or inconsistent. Darkwood's a little bit better in some ways. They all have a guaranteed super unique. And some of them could have pretty good for experience shrines as well. But Far Oasis has beetles, which is the main boon of Far Oasis compared to these other areas which are more likely to spawn experience shrines. Beetles are very good experience. Of course, Far Oasis also typically has more elite packs as well, so yeah. But these areas are more likely to give you experience shrines. They're also very consistent in how they spawn elites as well. The monster types in Far Oasis can be annoying too, like maggots that burrow under the ground. So that's not necessarily great. the main thing plaguing these areas is the fact that they're so fast and you spend so much time in loading screens, but also the fact that they're very inconsistent. Sometimes you'll get a spawn where there's very few elites at all, which is very typical of these areas. You might be able to kill a few, and then it's new game, and then sometimes you're just stuck looking for elites in small crevices because you don't find any. And they're just so small, and you just don't want to keep reloading the game over and over. And it's just, I don't know. It's kind of trouble. At least they typically have at least a decent number of elite packs sometimes. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, you could make an argument for these areas being B tier potentially, but it really depends. And these areas typically last longer, so there's not as much reloading, and there's more monsters to kill in these areas. Whereas these areas, it's difficult, and the monster types are either more annoying or lower experience. So that's typically what it comes down to there. See, at least once you get to the Crypto Mausoleum, there's more to kill than in some of these areas as well. So, you know, even though the density is definitely lower in those areas. So Travancore is just a really tiny area. Once again, lots of reloading into Act 3, running all the way down the bridge. The council members aren't terrible for experience at level 99, so that's the good news. You also can get a lot of elites oftentimes right around the waypoint where you spawn in and around the council itself. So it could be okay, but typically you only kill maybe like 2 to 3 elite packs, if that, usually less, and then you just go for the council, and you're just constantly reloading it, and it's not that great experience. If you're soloing it, it's actually pretty okay, but once again, you're just spending so much time not killing monsters, which is really a theme of Team C here, is that you're spending a lot of time not killing the monsters you either want to kill or not killing the monsters, period. Bloody Foothills. Bloody Foothills, you can get Shank, but remember, if you kill Shank, any of the monsters around him blow up and don't give you experience. So you only get credit for the monsters you actually kill. That's not really a good thing. Dak Farron is always there too at the end, in the middle of Bloody Foothills. If you just go all the way from like Shank to Dak Farron, I've found that's the most effective strategy. And Dak Farron doesn't give a ton of experience. He's not a high experience monster type. And the Shank monsters aren't even minions, so yeah, it's kind of weak. There are a decent amount of elite packs you can often get along the way, though. I'd say the big saving grace of this area that really prevents it from being garbage tier, absolutely trash tier, is the fact that oftentimes you get a lot of density. There's a lot of monsters like quill rats, the spear throwers, spear chuckers, and the archers that really load you up on experience. So they're pretty solid. You get crazy archer density oftentimes in here, so the density can actually be pretty solid. It is inconsistent as well, though. So, and you do get 2 super uniques, and you can get elites around it, and it's pretty fast. I'd say the main problem is you're just constantly creating games. Another case of a lot of not killing monsters, a lot of inconsistency, a lot of either caused by small areas or having to find it or having to get it, or going around not knowing exactly where the elite packs are, because it's just so open and difficult to access the other parts of the area. Definitely a lot of issues like that in Tier C. However, at least in the C tier and above, you can be confident that you can get good scenarios and it won't feel absolutely terrible to try to run for experience, especially B and above. That's where you're really looking at the good terror zones. Of course, the ones to really be excited about, I would say, are definitely the S tier terror zones. However, anything in the A tier, I think, is also worthy of being, given a pretty solid thumbs up to as well. B tier, I would say, is decent. This will keep you going. These are the areas that start to put you to sleep. And once we go into the D and F tier, that's really where you're going to find some areas that are really going to put you to sleep. And so we have Tristram. Now, this area was grossly overrated, I think, by a lot of people. Heck, we even did it ourselves. And I think it's because we thought, well, you could pop into there, you know. It's a very small area. It's got a lot of elite packs. And if you use a certain method of avoiding Griswold, you can spawn an extra elite pack. And it's all good stuff. But there's a setup to it. You know, someone has to spawn them a certain way. They have to find the Tristram portal, which is always on the path, so it's not too hard to find. But they have to find that. They have to set it up. They have to spawn everyone in, and by the time you do that, you get like maybe a solid, 4 to 6 elite packs, maybe less though, unfortunately, because of champion spawns, and then you're done. And just it's constantly resetting. It's like an instant thing, and you're spending so much time in loading screens. And the monster types aren't high experience; they're just not, and it's just very inconsistent. So this area really struggles in the consistency zone, and it's just, there's a lot of dings. There's just a lot of dings, and there's not a lot going for it. Area Plateau, kind of similar. The one super unique doesn't have minions. It can spawn you anywhere in the zone, the waypoint. So the elites in a lot of ways can be absolutely anywhere, from pretty much alongside the whole stretch of the area. And then, of course, you don't get too much off of killing Thresh Socket for experience, so it's pretty balls. Not gonna lie, pretty balls. Terra Zone. The density is definitely nowhere near what even Bloody Foothills can get sometimes. So, yeah, it's so inconsistent. Sometimes you get a decent amount of elite packs right around the waypoint, but yeah, it's pretty bad. Durance has a similar problem. Durance, you would think, would be one of the better Terra zones because there's like 3 levels and stuff. But finding the actual elite packs is challenging. Obviously, finding Mephisto can take a while, even with good map knowledge. The elite packs can be almost anywhere sometimes in like a very hard to see area. Lots of very dangerous monster types too, just kind of littered throughout. Difficult to spot the elite packs even if you find them, so it takes a while. If you only go for Durance 3, which is definitely a viable strategy, you find yourself in a worse Travancore scenario where essentially the experience you're getting is mostly the council members. But now, and unlike Travancore where you spawn directly into it, you have to find it. So it's like a Travancore you have to find, and then kill Mephisto, which isn't going to give you a lot of experience. And 2 of the council members are isolated, and it's like half of a Travancore. Yeah, there's elite packs in there, and there might be a couple along the way. But overall, it's just a really tough area to navigate and to like actually kill stuff for experience. You waste so much time spinning your wheels in the Durance of Hate, and that's just one of the main issues with this area, making it like really bad. It's just dog doo-doo tier in terms of trying to get experience in there. I think, like I said, at best, it's like a worse Travancore. I think that's the best way really to put it, and Travancore isn't really that good for experience. F-tier zones, this is where, you get some areas where these definitely, if you're feeling tired, you should probably just call it a night if you see any of these. There's only 2 Terra zones listed here, though. But if you see either of these, it's pretty bad. It's really hard to get experience in these areas. It can be troublesome. Sometimes you might get some decent scenarios with any of these Terra zones. Let's be real. Sometimes you will get decent experience in any Terra zone. Doesn't matter which one it is. But once again, these are like the average experience, right? Yeah, another problem with Durance too is that density is really awful too, typically. Like, there's just a lot of problems typically with these areas. Tristram's really hit or miss. So it just really depends. So if you go like Bloodmore and Den of Evil, like sometimes there's a decent amount of packs surrounding the Den of Evil and up to the Den of Evil. However, oftentimes there's not. Sometimes you actually get almost nothing in the Bloodmoor, and you have to go traverse all the way to the end of the Den of Evil to get to the only pack that's really worth killing, because there's no density in the Den of Evil up until Corpse Fire. So yeah, getting to that one consistent super unique is a real headache. And the Bloodmoor has like no density, and the elite pack spawns are extremely inconsistent and can be spread out through a pretty large area, even though it's pretty easy to access. And the monster types are typically the lower experience unless they're the zombies. So yeah, pretty bad stuff. The only consistently good mob, once again, is at the very end of an area that you have to find at the end of the path, and that is all the way at the end of the area, and it's definitely a travel time, definitely a real travel time. It's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. I mean, I could see some people putting this in their D tier because sometimes Bloodmoor isn't terrible, but yeah, it's pretty easy to access through the Cold Plains waypoint, but still, it's pretty bad. There's just not a lot going for it, and the number of elite packs and how spread out they are, and the lack of density, it just doesn't feel at all worth it. Like, I'd say lack of just having almost zero density is just one of those things that just really kills an area too. It's really gonna put it down into the gutter of these lists here. Cross sewers. I don't even think this area needs an introduction either. This is kind of like tombs, Tombs. I think everyone realizes how ridiculous tombs can be. However, cross sewers. This area is horrible, and I don't think anyone has a problem with this being in the F tier at all. I think this is at least for experience generation. I don't think anyone can argue that. It's just really low density, really scant. Finding sewers 2 is always a nightmare, which might be decent, but sometimes has absolutely nothing. You have one super unique that's on sewers 2, which is actually kind of decent, but that's about it. And then everywhere else, it's like dolls, it's hard to see them, everything's hiding behind blocks and corners, it's dark. Even if you have mobility, it's just tough to kill the monsters. A lot of the monster types move really fast and escape and go over the canals and shit and everything. It's just like, oh man, it's terrible. And it's such a huge area that finding the elite packs, yeah, it should be around where you enter, but that's not always the case, and they're sometimes spread out everywhere, and it's just and of course the monster types, some of them are extremely dangerous, particularly the dolls as well. And even though there are some decent experienced monsters in here, it's just such a nightmare finding and killing stuff in here. Really is a real nightmare killing stuff in there and getting that stuff. Density is terrible. Finding the elite packs is terrible. There's usually not that many elite packs. Finding sewers 2 is terrible, and sometimes sewers 2 has nothing. It's really it's really there's just a lot of issues with it, and these two bottom terror zones here really exemplify all of the issues that can be wrong with a terror zone, pretty much, except with maybe like one bright spot in either one, and that's about it. There's some higher experienced monsters in the sewers, sometimes, not even always, but sometimes, and the Bloodmoor, at least it could be easier to find the monsters. In a lot of cases, but it's hard to identify when you're out of monsters, so that's just another issue as well. Because remember, the Den of Evil is no cave, where there's like almost a guaranteed 11, 12 elite packs. It's one at the very end of the cave, and then unlike the Cold Plains that actually has a pretty decent density and a lot of good elite packs, Bloodmoor, it's just hard to identify what the heck is going on. So it's just such a huge, massive gap between those two terror zones, and they're right next to each other, which is the it's interesting. And then you get other ones that are also kind of next to these other ones that are somewhere in the middle, and they have similar issues. They pretty much have all the benefits of maybe a Cold Plains, but they don't have a cave, so they don't have a pit. And these areas are just nuts. So in terms of density and elite packs and things of that nature. So yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. But overall, that is Maxrolls and my own assessment of where the Terra Zones kind of stand in terms of experience generation. Once again, let me know what you think about that in the comments below. I definitely want to very thoroughly go over the experience and how we kind of see experience generation after doing a lot of testing and after doing multiple 99 pushes and things of that nature. So, yeah, it's really cool. You know, what really dings Terra Zones for the most part is lack of consistency. And the more consistency they lack, and the harder it is to access things or find packs or the quality of the packs, whatever, or the density, they all start to drop as you go down the list. And what you see up here is just insanely solid density and elite density and insanely good access. And easy ways to split the area as well. Just crazy experience from monster types when you get around this area as well. Just like really good stuff overall. So hope you guys enjoy and hope you guys find that list very useful in determining, you know, whether or not you will find an area useful or good for experience. Maybe you learned something from that, didn't realize some of those areas were actually good. Maybe you just in your head thought they were bad, but now you can know from a lot of experience testing which ones are actually good and which ones are not. This is the Loot Terra Zone tier list, and this one looks a lot more similar to Maxroll's original tier list, which is what caused the confusion, because a lot of people are like, well, these areas suck for experience. How could you rate them so high? Like, for instance, Travancore on the Loot Terra Zone tier list is amazing for items because council members are already broken for items, and if you make them level 99 and able to drop Griffins, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy stuff, right? You make Travancore incredible in terms of its item drop potential with Terra Zone. Secret Cow level's kind of similar, you know, all 96 cows, now they can all drop every item fairly easily, and there's huge density in this area, right? Talrash's tombs are still insane when it comes to loot because of the density. You know, monster density really factors into this. You know, monster types in this case, ghosts tend to drop more runes, so those tend to be really good monster types for loot. Number of elite groups, bosses definitely factor more into this, so bosses being able to drop any item in the game, more bosses being able to do that. Number of elite groups, the overall challenge of the area in terms of farming it logistically or due to monster types, I'd say weighs heavier on the loot list, because for experience you can get maybe a whole team to help you. Loot is typically more of an individual endeavor, so that's why it's a bit more of a factor in this Terra Zone tier list. But you can see though, you know, you can see there's a big difference. Like, these are both C tier on the experience list. They're now S tier on the loot list, as they should be. These are both also S tier on the experience list, and so is this one. However, they're also on the item list because, you know, they've got bosses, they've got tons of density, they've got great monster types, whatever it is. Really, really amazing stuff overall. Even for like seal popping and chaos is pretty nutty. Flare jungle, flare dungeon, just crazy, crazy density. And crazy density for level 96 monsters that can drop anything in the game. And kind of see similar themes at Worldstone Keep and Throne as well. Of course, in a lot of these areas, not a lot changes in terms of what could drop, but there is increased probability that the very high treasure class items can drop, like a Griffin's or a Death's Fathom, due to the area being terrorized and due to the monsters being at higher levels. So that is something to take into account. So like, for instance, for the pit, you definitely see this influencing the pit, absolutely. And the pit, like, typically could almost drop any item in the game from every monster, but now it can, and it has crazy density as well. Pit does take some time to access, though, and then maybe the density and the monster types aren't quite as favorable as some other areas, but it's still a very solid Terra Zone. You'll see the S tier is a bit more elitist in the Loot Terra Zone tier list because these areas really stand out in terms of their loot potential due to just crazy density or crazy good monster types or a combination of all of them. And these areas in the A tier start to drop off a little bit in that potential. But as you can see, there's still a lot of overlap with the experience. Hero Zone tier list, you have the Tower Seller also performing very well here. The Countess, of course, being a boss as well. Very good stuff. You have very good monster types. You got Ghosts down there as well. You have pretty decent density. Snowy Tomb and Rocky Waste, the monster types aren't amazing for finding items, which is the main ding. But besides that, I mean, still very solid density and lots of elite packs. They're a lot better as an experience zone, though. And, of course, Cathedral and Catacombs, kind of the same thing. You do get Dariel as a boss, at least here. But pretty similar reason why these aren't quite as high as these really crazy loot potential areas that really stand out on the loot Terror Zone tier list. Arcane really stands out as a loot area because you can get Zod Rune from the Ghosts. With the area being terrorized, you can get so many insane items, and you can kill everything, including the Ghosts, and get high runes very easily in this area. So, yeah, really good loot potential in here. Noah Thok being terrorized is good for loot potential being increased. You also just have solid density in here, which is good. For items, once again, though, the lack of consistency can hurt it a little bit, though. Of course, Noah Thok's Temple is also referring to Pendle Skin, which can drop every item in the game as well, so that's also a consideration for the loot one. Endurance of Hate, of course, has Mephisto. There's council members in Endurance 3. For this one, you pretty much want to go straight to Endurance 3 no matter what. There's definitely a few different approaches to attempting experience in here. I say attempting experience in here. Because in hardcore, I don't know. You know, I mostly play hardcore, so for me, it's a rough thing. I don't use a hardcore bias when verifying these lists myself. However, I definitely think of softcore. However, even thinking of softcore, you have to think how difficult traversing these areas are, which is why I don't really I don't mention how dangerous the monsters are too often. But it does sometimes make things a bit more difficult, even on softcore, because remember, dying makes you lose experience. It is a consideration. But Endurance of Hate, though, it's definitely for loot. You're definitely going for Mephisto and the council members. Endurance 3. Very, very solid sources of items if they are very high monster level and they're terrorized at that high monster level. Dry Hills and Halls of the Dead. Very solid density. Once again, I mean, this area is really solid. Just really crazy density and really crazy potential for loot in here if cleared properly. Act 2 Sewers isn't nearly as good of an item drop area as it is for experience, and once again, this is mainly due to monster types. It mainly due to monster types. It just lacks good monster types. Even though it has pretty other good factors that make it amazing for experience, it's not all that great. You could argue it's an A tier loot farm. You can definitely make that argument. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, the monster types are kind of piss poor for loot, but they're really good for experience if you just run it all the way through and you just hit them really fast. But yeah, it is what it is on that one though. Jail is definitely kind of in the same boat. At least it has good monster types, but it doesn't have as much elites or elite density as Sewers. So you see, you'll notice that what's really favored on the loot one is bosses. They're very much favored. Really crazy density. That's another thing that's favored. And really good monster types. And a combination of all three is definitely favored. And so when you move away from things like that, and you move away from the bosses and the really good bosses and the other things of that nature and the really insane density, even if it has a good number of elite packs, that's not enough for it necessarily to push it into the A tier or the S tier. And so these areas are still pretty good. all these areas. Like Icy Cellar has good monster types, but they could be pretty dangerous, and it could be a hard area to farm. Also, not a lot of elites, so they're more spread out in a lot of cases. And, monster types less favorable, less bosses, and that's why the S tier and the A tier seems more exclusive here. It's because it is, once again, really high density bosses. Those are the things that really matter. Really easy to smash elite packs one after the other. Now, that is the case for Act 2 Sewers, but it doesn't have the crazy, just pure monster density, which is really good for grinding a Terra Zone in terms of farming it, when every monster can drop every item in the game. So that might be really good for experience, but to have a lot of elite packs, but sometimes you would rather just have more density. And so just pure density is often favored over a number of elite packs overall on this list, just because every monster is capable of dropping every item, and that really kind of changes the dynamics of how you want to farm those Terror Zones. Bloody Foothills has pretty good density and it has Shank. So in terms of Shank, blowing up everything, that's pretty good actually for items. Not great for experience, but it's good for items, which is why it's a tier lower on the experience tier list. Frigid, also pretty good. It's just Eldritch, you can hit up the monsters to get a couple of very guaranteed items pretty easily. And, some of these areas are held up because of their number of elite packs, but not because of their sheer monster density, which, tends to favor the A and S tier areas once again. I could say more about some of these other areas, just good numbers of elite packs in a lot of these areas. Like Cold Plains Cave is amazing for experience, but in terms of actually farming items, it just doesn't have the sheer monster density. The monsters per pixel, to justify it, given that monsters have the potential to drop everything that has to be considered for loot. However, for experience, moving from elite pack one to the next is definitely typically the most effective strategy. So for experience, it's just quite a bit different. C tier. Well, these areas, they could be just hard to farm really when it comes down to it. They lack maybe some of that density. Like Crystalline Passage Frozen River has great elite density, but not necessarily density. The monster types are very challenging, so farming this area can be very frustrating. Especially, once again, there's more of a solo focus for the loot tier list because people like to farm for a loot solo typically, so people don't yoink it. When it comes to experience, it's definitely more of a both focus. Solo P8 is definitely a thing on the experience tier list. And of course, so is group pushing the Terror Zones in various ways. So there's a bit more of a dual focus there. For loot, it's definitely trying to just get loot, solo farm these areas, being able to do it without too much difficulty in general, being able to kill as many of these monsters as possible. And so these areas with less overall monster density, once again, even if they have a good number of elite packs, tend to be less favored in terms of loot, especially when they don't have good bosses or they don't have bosses, period. You definitely see that going down. And then, of course, areas like this, just really scant density. Yeah, density is really, really big consideration. That's why monster density is listed first in this list here. It's arguably monster density and types, so like bosses, are the biggest consideration. Of course, bosses and number of elite groups is a consideration, but it's when every monster could drop every item, it's just got to be the biggest consideration to consider things like that. And so that's why the Secret Kel level, it really turns it on its head, because classic magic finding, even though monsters in 85 areas can drop, most items, they can't drop all of them. And there's a lot they can't drop. Like Crown of Ages, they can't drop, they can't drop Tyrell's Might. They can't drop a lot of things, actually. And depending on the area, if it's less than 85, they can't drop Griffins. And it really changes the dynamic when all of a sudden that's possible from every monster. So And any build that can just kind of mass clear the monsters is gonna be pretty hugely advantaged by this for sure. Of course, I would say Berserk Barbarians are advantaged by the number of elite packs, always more so, but they've always been pretty much able to get every item anyway, so that they're not as largely benefited by some of these Terror Zone spawns to begin with. And there is some benefit from the the treasure class increase, but it's just not as much. You're mostly getting benefit for the builds that can clear as many of these monsters as possible, and so the more density, the better of any monster really in these areas when it comes to loot finding. Once again, for experience, it's quite a bit different, but you really want those level 99 monsters for the experience if you're in a 96 Terror Zone. As many as possible, and density does factor into helping you out, especially if it's easy to kill like Inflator, but it's it's quite a bit of a different consideration. Which once again really explains why we've split these Terror Zone tier lists. It really explains why they are split to begin with. All right, anyway, so like Outer Steps, Plains of Despair, once again challenging monsters. Difficult, killing Izzy for loot, not really. Not very good for loot at all. And you could really see this here. I mean, Tristram to some extent is like this as well. Not great to kill for loot, but not necessarily worse than too many other areas. It's a little bit better for loot than it is for experience, actually, because there's actually like a lot of like random monsters. Like the density of regular monsters in Tristram isn't too bad. It just really comes down to the elite packs being so inconsistent. And then I mean, this is just a terrible area for loot. It always has been. Fire builds have always been good in Burial Grounds, Crypto Mausoleum, but you have to find it. It's harder to access. So there's definitely a lot of like overlap between these two tier lists. But you'll see there's some pretty major differences, especially like if you see these two areas right here, they're nowhere near S tier in the consideration for experience. They're terrible for experience. They're pretty bad. They're in the lower half. And so it's there's some pretty big change. There's some pretty big differences. Some of these, I mean, they're like up or down one. Arcane's a pretty big difference too, though, because it can be tough to get those elite packs for experience in there. But when it comes to just plowing it for loot, it's actually amazing. So as long as you have the right builds. So it's just, it just depends. And then some of these areas, their elite pack count and the ease of getting them is very solid. So they're better for experience. But when it comes to just raw density for dropping items, you don't typically find as many good items in these areas as quickly. And it's just, monster type and just monster density. It's not even the number of elite packs at that point. And, lacking bosses, actual boss monsters and things of that nature really dings some of these areas. Of course, the F tier here, there's actually only 2 Terror Zones in the D tier, but in the F tier, there's actually 3. And even though you do have Thresh Socket, you just once again have that one monster. That's pretty much the only thing that's even worth killing for Loot and Area Plateau. So that's pretty bad. Unless you just want to keep reloading the game. And on Battle.net map generation, where the Terror Zones are, currently it's you don't even always find him consistently. So it's not good at all. It's really terrible. Kuros Sewers, as bad as it is for experience, it's also bad for loot. The monster types are also not going to lend you, do not lend themselves to good loot as well. And once again, the raw density is extremely low in here. Bloodmore and Den of Evil similar. The raw density is just extremely low. And that's pretty much it. There you have it. Maxroll has split their Terror Zones, their Terror Zone 2 list into 2 lists, experience and loot. Of course, once again, you can check them all out here, and they're split the exact same way. And you can kind of check the differences and whatnot. And, I feel like I went over a lot of the reasons for why they're placed where they're at, and a lot of the reasons why the two lists themselves are different, and why Maxroll and and myself kind of struggled making a singular list. And there was a singular list, and that's how we rated the terror zones. And it's like, it's not very useful. It's not very useful because there's usually two types of players, or even if there's not two types of players, there's two types of scenarios. There might be one player at one point who is looking for experience, but other times they're looking for loot. And that's typically how it is. You either feel like farming loot or you feel like farming experience in PvE. Or farming players on on hardcore, but the terror zones don't factor into that. So typically that's what you're looking to do. And there are, to some extent, also two different types of players. There's players that care more about experience, and there's players that care about loot. There's definitely a lot of overlap between the two. However, that is also the case. So splitting this terror zone tier list into two different lists really makes a ton of sense. I hope now, with this added clarity, that everyone is able to understand these lists a lot better, especially with a lot of added testing as well. Not just the added clarity of splitting them into their two separate functions that they can serve. The terror zone's best served, which is loot and experience, or experience and loot. It's also just the fact of we farmed them a lot more. We actually got experience farming them. I did a ton of late ladder pushing on hardcore this season. Hardcore, softcore doesn't matter in terms of how good the zones are. However, in terms of like experience or loot, however, it's always important to mention that if you are playing hardcore, some of these areas you're going to want to be tankier than others. You're definitely going to want to make sure you have more health or more whatever. It could be from barb battle orders or whatever, but you're going to need more resistances, something. Some of these areas are very dangerous. One thing I really like about the terror zones is they really keep you on your toes, even on hardcore, where it's like there's a lot of monster types you didn't have to deal with as often before, like dolls and souls. Before you might see them in the throne room and that's it. So maybe one or two players out of the whole group would encounter them and kill them for you. But now they're everywhere. You get all kinds of dolls and souls and snakes, which are pretty dangerous. There's all kinds of different scenarios that can kill you and really keep you thinking about how to best stay alive. So even though, hardcore, softcore does not factor into these tiers, it is important to understand what are your dangerous monsters in there and how to avoid dying. Like charger zombies, for instance, the undead prowlers that charge into you and bypass your block and do absurd amounts of damage are more likely to be found in the halls or the ice caves. You just get a lot more crazy monster types just in general. And some of these areas are like way easier than your classic World Stone and Chaos overall, and they don't have any challenging monster types at all. But it's always nice to, have that change of tempo, a change of pace. Overall, I love the terror zones this season. I've loved testing them. I've loved playing the crap out of them. I've played them all multiple times. Haven't just not played them, even when they're bad. I've tried to make them work as best as I possibly could, which is how I feel like I've gained some accurate tiering of these areas. I've tried to make them work literally as best as possible. I've stratted how to run them and how to make sure that they're done and create a new game. Focusing on targeting elite packs for experience. For loot, definitely making sure that you're farming the good monster types and where the density is at, that kind of stuff. Like the bosses, the elite, the council members, the ghosts, whatever it is. But yeah, really cool stuff. Definitely think we made a very good decision here splitting them. I hope the community benefits from this very, very now solid, I would say pretty much almost definitive information about the relative strengths for both experience and loot of all of the terror zones. Of course, in the next patch, you never know, there could be new terror zones. They could add new things to the terror zones. They can, I don't know, they can make them more challenging. I wouldn't mind if they're a little more challenging. I wouldn't mind if, Sunder Charms as well were a bit more rare. I do feel like there's maybe a couple of adjustments that could be made that could make them even more exciting or interesting in the future. But overall, this has been a great journey. Anyway, let me know what you guys think about the new tiering that Maxroll has in the comments below for loot and experience. for the various terror zones and how you've enjoyed the terror zones in latter season 2. Anyway, you can catch the rest of my guides on here on Maxroll, of course, most of them under guides itself, on also the valuable, unique, and set items list as well under the resources and tools. Anyway, I will see you guys next time. Dark Humility, over and out. Twitch.tv/Dark Humility. See you guys next time.